Hello, thank you again for joining me for this week's reflections on the Acts of the Apostles. And we are a little ways into chapter 17, so if you haven't already, please read or review that before watching the video. And I left you last week talking about how Paul and Silas have taken the gospel message to the Thessalonians, who can be a little bit skeptical and require a little extra convincing, and how that compares to what in our age can be called a postmodern era. Folks who will only recognize authority that has been tested and approved. And testing the gospel truth really is an essential step for postmoderns, anybody who's grown up in the last 30 or so years. And Lutherans really shouldn't have a lot of issues with that, because Lutherans on the whole have always encouraged Bible study, questions, checking things out. That's part of our makeup. So we're not the type that say, the pastor says it, you believe it, that's all there is to it. So we're at chapter 17, starting at verse 13. So the Jews who had stirred up the mob in Thessalonica have, they hear about Paul, who's now moved on to Berea, and the activity that Paul is doing there to evangelize. So they come from Thessalonica. So they travel quite a ways to this out of the way city, off the beaten path, as it were, because they're just that much adversarial toward Paul. They come to employ the same public disturbance tactics that they used early, and they have similar results. They shake up the crowds. They want to have this mob-like activity toward Paul. So when it says that they shake up in verses, in these verses, the word is often used for a description of earthquakes. So they shake up, or they stir up the crowd, whatever the language is in your translation. Possibly because the Berean Christians realize that the Thessalonican Jews have the ear of the provincial authorities, what we would call a region maybe, or a county. They call them provinces, like my friends up in Canada. So possibly the folks here decide that for their situation with the government, discretion is the better part of valor. Before they arrest anybody, before they take any judicial actions, they courageously spirit Paul away toward the coast, even providing Paul with an escort. Now, again, if you haven't already, you don't have a map of that area in that time period, you might want to have one handy to keep track of Paul's journey and how it's evolving here. So this is a second withdrawal for Paul, and it's going to be proved another advance of the gospel. So Paul isn't just being, shut out or thrown away in this case. God uses Paul and this part of spiriting Paul away to the coast as another advance of the gospel. So not only does Paul leave behind a newly planted church to be nurtured by Silas and Timothy, he leaves them in Berea, and Luke stayed in Philippi. So the advance of the gospel continues even though some of the church leaders, the evangelism leaders, are staying behind to make sure that there is ongoing and continued growth, answer questions, lead, all those kinds of things. So Paul now is going to take the gospel to Athens, which is the center of the Greco-Roman culture and Greek religion. So now the missionaries have split up to work on 3 growing congregations. Some of you pastors, some of the pastors that I know, started out after seminary with 3 congregations. It's not unlike that in some ways, other than travel. The gospel, under Paul's evangelism, progresses like wildfire. Church plants in Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, now Athens. So the adversaries try to stamp it out in one place, yet it crops up in another. But they don't actually quite get to stamp it out in the first place, because Silas, Timothy, Luke, they're all staying, and they keep fanning the flames of the gospel. And Paul, it seems, is prepared to go anywhere as long as the gospel keeps moving forward. So let me summarize here. To be a believer means not only someone of noble character that commits itself to the message, it also means having a courageous soul that commits itself to the messengers, or the messenger, Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke, whoever is spreading the truth of the gospel, and to all who are part of what will soon become known as the body of Christ. Often we're still using the Greek word in these texts of ecclesia to represent church, the gathering of the believers. So postmoderns have a hard time with long-term commitment in relationships, as they do with subjecting themselves to authority figures and in a divine message like this. Luke's presentation of the Bereans' acceptance of the gospel and of this commitment to Paul's safety provides hope that people are reasonable. People, when you present them with the truth of the gospel, when you still stay with them, answering questions and challenges, helping them explore by the power of the Spirit, anybody can have what it takes to commit to being a Christ follower. So we should never stop our own personal witness or give up on someone who does not immediately respond the way we think they should. There's still hope, kind of a stick-to-itiveness that we need to continue on as we witness to others, even when there may be some skepticism. So moving now, chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. The prevailing philosophies of our post-Christian era, which we are in kind of post-Christian era because the churches are dwindling. The numbers of people who say they are Christian are going down. I think in the last 20, 30 years, whatever it is, we've shrunk by 20%. We're getting close to that 60-some% number, and it's said that once we, as Christians, dip below 50% of the country, we would be considered the minority religion. So just keep that in mind as I use words like post-Christian era. That's what I'm talking about. So what grows up in its place if we're not all Christian? And we're not. This nation is not all Christian. If you haven't figured that out, you need to get out more. So there's such things like secular humanism, scientific observations of people who will only believe what they can see and what can be proven. New Age pantheism, that there's this all is one kind of universalism in that sense, along beside postmodernism, that there is no absolute truth. So we are in this country becoming remarkably similar to Epicureanism. Feeling good is the ultimate goal, over above everything else, or Stoicism, that knowledge is the highest good. Paul encounters all of that in Athens. It is going to be a whole new cultural experience for Paul. And Paul's speech then becomes a model for us for how to witness to and educate those who are of a post-Christian mindset in what's becoming a post-Christian culture here in the United States, even as Luke was doing it with Theophilus and his fellow seekers in this first century pre-Christian mindset. I know it's interesting to be the church these days, I know. So, proclaiming the gospel with integrity, that's what we need to focus on. When Paul arrived at Athens, in the province or the region of Achaia, he came to what would have been considered an anomaly, perhaps. Though its population was no more than 10,000, and it had been reduced to poverty and submission by its war with Rome in the year 146 BC, it was granted the status of a free city, despite all the problems, in view of its illustrious past as a metropolitan area. Okay, we're talking about Athens here. We're not talking about some small village. Free cities were able to govern themselves and have much of their own free will, if you will. The time of Athens' great glory has forever changed. Athens can still boast of her right to be called a great center of philosophy, architecture, art, and religion. In fact, what assaulted Paul's spirit was the abundance of idolatry in his thinking. Guarding the entrance to houses and shrines was a square pillar with the head of Hermes on it, the god of roads, gateways, and the marketplace. What Paul met in Athens seems to be an unlimited number of idols. So Paul is more greatly distressed, as we read in the text, feeling as if his spirit has been attacked, a provocation of anger or grief or both, because the glory due God alone is being given to idols. God reacted to the same way about idolatry in Israel, and you can read about that in the book of Deuteronomy, the Psalms, Isaiah, a number of different prophets and things like that. Any paraphernalia of false worship should provoke each of us to reach out and share the good news, which includes a call to repentance. I'm not talking about judgment here. I'm talking about sharing the good news of the gospel, being a public witness for your faith and why it has such meaning for you. That does call for repentance, again, not in judgmental tones, but just saying, turn away from this false god, idol, come back 180 degrees to the true God. Some current day idols. I know we don't like to think about it, and I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to challenge you to think about these things in your life or your friends' lives and whether or not they can become idols. Money, career advancement, property, house, car, celebrity status. There's even been a popular television show in these United States called American Idol. It has been a television program since 2002. 24 years. American Idol, in which people compete for celebrity status. People compete to become America's next celebrity idol. We're starting to put it right in the names of things. So I don't want to offend, yet I want to challenge. We need to think clearly about what is an idol or what is not an idol in our life, and how much allegiance we owe to Jesus Christ and to God. So Paul reaches out in witness in the synagogue, which is his want to go to the Jews first. He also reaches out in his witness in the marketplace, it says, day by day, with those who happen to be there. Verse 17. And the marketplace was the center of public and business life for the city. Anybody who is anybody, if you want, will go. They hang out in the marketplace. They do business. They do public life there. People met there every day to learn the latest news. They didn't have the internet or newspapers or magazines or anything. They went down to the marketplace, get the latest news, discuss all manners of subjects. Temples, government buildings, shops, offices, altars, statues, all of that fills the marketplace area. Porches and walkways give protection against the summer sun and the winter rain and cold. So it was the place to be in the day. So the equivalent today, maybe a park, maybe a city square in some smaller towns. I think of Savannah, Georgia now, that has all those beautiful city squares, street corners, shopping malls, if they still exist, even a neighborhood bar, a coffee shop, restaurant, nightclub, the student centers on campuses, wherever people meet when they are at leisure, okay, even sometimes doing business. So the church is commanded in Matthew 28 to go where the people are. Go, not stay and expect people to come to you. Go, Jesus said. Go to those settings where serious discussion and ideas are happening. Even religious ideas happen in those discussions. It is a natural thing. It's to be expected. And for Paul, we're getting a picture of what that looks like. You know, I know of pastors around the country, at least many of colleagues of mine in the Lutheran Church, but I'm sure in other denominations too, they've decided to dedicate one afternoon a week to sit at a table, a local coffee shop, whatever it is, hang a little sign maybe from the front of the table or put a little placard in front of them, inviting anybody who wants to just sit and have a conversation. So the pastor, whether she or he, buys himself some beverage, coffee, tea, whatever you drink, and if no one sits down with that person, then the pastor can work on a sermon, can work on a Bible study, can do whatever that pastor does. Read a book, take the computer, the laptop along. That maybe is not as aggressive as what Paul did, although it is more assertive than most Lutherans tend to be. Maybe even most other mainline denominations. Paul's evangelism, again, follows a pattern of reasoning about Jesus and the resurrection. Compare that to the beginning of chapter 17. So Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, representatives of two of the three major philosophical schools of thought in Paul's day, react to his message. The Epicureans mock Paul. What is this babbler trying to say? And the Stoics are curious. They say, well, he seems to be advocating a foreign god. You can see that in verse 18. So, Epicureans viewed reality as endless chance, combining and scattering atoms. Like, the world has no creator, the world came into being through random chance, like the Big Bang Theory. They would find the concept of a bodily resurrection laughable, because resurrected to what? They don't believe that there's a creator or heaven or anything like that. So Stoics, pantheists, identified the divine as the principle of reason, encompassing everything, and perhaps in the form of what they would call fate, or the fates, governing everything and everyone. They believed in a kind of a cyclical eschatology, that history seems to repeat itself in that language. Later, they take on and adopt that of Plato's concept of the soul's immortality, which meant that they could not conceive of a bodily resurrection. They might have believed, as one person wrote, we are the cosmos made conscious, and life is the means by which the universe understands itself. That comes from a physicist, more modern day physicist. So these reactions of the people in the marketplace show us that Paul had proclaimed the simple gospel with integrity to the intellectual sophisticates of Athens. In today's marketplace, we must reintroduce post-Christians to Jesus with fresh ideas and cultural relevance. I'm not saying we water down the gospel, but I'm saying we meet people where they are. We must also do so with faithfulness, telling the gospel in a way that will open doors to belief and understanding, not watering it down, explaining it in terms that they can accept and understand. Paul's message has created such a stir among the Epicureans and the Stoics that they bring him before the Areopagus, Athens' chief legislative and judicial council. Now here he's not being brought forward in order to be punished or arrested. They're curious and they want him to talk to their council, their leaders. So this body of leadership is the ones who would license traveling lecturers, if you will. And Paul's hearers in the marketplace want to see whether he should be given the freedom to continue to teach with authority by the Areopagus. So they want to understand this new teaching. For some strange, rather surprising, astounding ideas are coming to their ears, it tells us in 19 and 20. So they're curious. They want to know more. They want to understand it. Should we license this guy and give him authority to speak and teach in Athens? The Athenians had an ambivalent relationship with foreign gods. They weren't for or against necessarily, just curious. On the one hand, they were famous for incorporating alien deities into their pantheon or their collective. On the other hand, they believed they must stay vigilant lest new gods undermine the morals of the state. So they were curious, but they weren't gullible. The fearlessness and the relevant witness of Paul models an approach that Christians in every society need to take to heart as we witness. Christians need to engage the opinion makers, the shapers of thought and reason in such a way that resonates with thoughtful, modern and postmodern men and women to at least gain a hearing for the gospel by the reasonableness of its presentation. Luke prepares us for a lack of a positive response to Paul's sermon by portraying Athenians as intellectual dabblers more than genuine seekers after truth. Athens' intellectual life was characterized by uncertainty and turmoil, so a fascination with whatever was new was very strong for them. Postmodernism and post-Christian eras have some of those same tendencies. A fascination with what may be new can be very strong, with some sense of uncertainty and a possibility of turmoil. So Paul gives his assessment to the Athenians. He sees or perceives that they are a very religious people, according to verse 22. The Athenians' reputation for religious piety is well attested. The idea of being very religious may be understood either negatively as superstitious fear or of the gods, or in a more neutral or even positive sense. Paul puts this ambiguity to good use. Considering verses 23 and 30, he probably wants to say they have religion and it's a little bit wrong-headed. You have religion, you just don't really get what you should get. So there is a respectful recognition of religious endeavors, although not an acknowledgement that they lead to any true saving faith in God, Yahweh God. So Paul is telling a simple yet limited truth and creating a basis for further comment. Paul now uncovers their need, the knowledge of the one true God. As he walked around and observed, that is, he examined carefully their objects of worship, he says, he found an altar with an inscription, "To an unknown God," according to verse 23. So now Paul has his opening. He makes his point of contact, saying that what they worship as something unknown, literally what they worship in ignorance, he will teach them. He will proclaim to them. This is no new God. Okay? Not to worry. I'm not introducing any new God to you. Nothing to fear here. It's simply that God's identity is now being unveiled to those who admit, if only unconsciously, that they are ignorant to an unknown God. This is brilliant for Paul. The Athenians feared how a new God could disrupt their life under Rome, and Paul basically says, don't worry, it's not a new God. I'm simply revealing to you the identity of what you say is an unknown God. Brilliant. Brilliant. Paul is not suggesting that they already have a saving relationship with God. Paul is stressing the ignorance with which they worship. This is Paul's way to raise the basic question, who is God? Well, I want to leave you with that question. Okay, I know. Always leave them wanting more, eh? So I want to thank you for joining me again on this journey through the Acts of the Apostles. We're in chapter 17. Haven't quite finished it yet. This is an awesome place to stop, I think. Paul is brilliant in approaching the gospel message with these Athenians and their worship of an unknown God. Hope you're having a great week. Take care. God bless.